Metroid Prime is a series full of potential, but whose developers have proven they don't quite understand why it works. The original game is a great opener, and Echoes is an amazing sequel that rightfully deserves not only praise, but the same remaster treatment as the original. Then came Corruption, a game that suffers from a dream of telling a grander story, of addressing the flaws of Metroid Prime, namely a lack of handholding and levels that aren't straight lines. Then, almost 2 decades later, Beyond is made, doing a great impression of the original and Echoes, while failing to actually execute on what people love the series for. It's funny in a way, as every subsequent game has gotten further away from what the series' greatest strength is: exploration. It's one of the core pillars of a Metroidvania, and yet, for some reason, each game is developed to avoid it as much as possible. It's the only element that's reduced or even removed in Corruption and Beyond, which earlier games have. It's obviously not the only difference. Corruption and Beyond are both afraid of making beams complex, of telling a story that is bare bones with little character or dialogue, of visors, of morph ball sections, and of players doing anything the developers don't intend. There are a lot of problems compounding on the newer titles, but exploration is the biggest. It's the most impactful. Given that, I figured I'd close off my reviews of the Metroid Prime series with a sort of retrospective, a critique of the series overall. What exactly is it that works in each game, and what doesn't? Why are the original games that released for the GameCube the best the series has to offer? Why is Corruption the turning point for the series? Why did Beyond fall flat with some fans while others liked it? And if anyone were to try and make a Metroid Prime of their own, whether it be a Metroid Prime 5 or a wholly new IP, what elements from each game would you want to pull from? The series has always worked best when it leans into what makes Samus unique: her equipment. This takes different forms in each game, but when one tries to truly explore each piece of equipment, the game's at its best. This is easiest to see with the morph ball and the arm cannon. The morph ball is inherently hard to design around, especially in a 3D first-person game like the Prime series. It's often easier to fall back on 2D environments, places that feel like speed bumps that slow you down. Moments where you need to line yourself up to bomb jump take time, so it's easy to think that these need to be minimized. I can't blame anyone for thinking this. I mean, how do you design sections for a ball in a first-person game? Well, quite easily. You make sure there's a chance of failure and consequences when you do fail. Sometimes this can be as simple as needing to start over while you roll across a thin rail, even if it's a long trek. Other times, it's placing a hazard like lava or acid beneath a surface that will disintegrate if you take too long. It can even be the classic half-pipe, challenging the player to go higher than they need to go. It's even better when they aren't obvious to the player, blending in with the environment so players don't immediately recognize them. As for the slower 2D sections, they're also good when they're built around the morph ball's abilities. Both work perfectly. Needing to use bombs to double jump, to avoid hazards that turn on and off, opening shortcuts after you finish a section, these are all good. Even the environment itself can be brought into this section, such as how water sometimes has updrafts that let the morph ball jump higher, or even cause the morph ball to float up. Of course, that's not to say that any environment works. Metroid Prime 3 has these things called snatchers, which attach to the morph ball and cause it to float, similar to water and Echoes. It's the same mechanic, but it doesn't feel anywhere near as good. Compared to updrafts in water, where you only float up where there are bubbles, the snatchers let you float up till you reach a certain height. They even let you nudge yourself left or right, pairing well with another creature, the Korba, that tries to eat you. The water works because it's a singular point where you can float. There's no maneuvering, only planning out where you need to go and hoping you take the right bubbles. The snatchers don't work, in comparison, because they are not only way too slow, but it's also so easy to avoid the Korba that there is absolutely no risk. If they caused you to float faster, if you were funneled to the Korba so it would be harder to avoid it, it might be fun. Onto the arm cannon. It is a versatile weapon, capable of switching its beam. The early games leaned into this mechanic, encouraging players not only to use every beam at their disposal, but also to mix up their approach and experiment to see what works best in each scenario. Better yet, because switching beams meant a brief period where you couldn't attack, there's a tactical angle to the choice. You can't simply change on a whim. There's a risk, even if it is quite small. Later games mistakenly identified this as a flaw that needs to be patched out, rather than a seed that needs to be nurtured. Corruption did away with multiple beams entirely, making it so you only ever use the power beam, then only the plasma beam, then only the nova beam. Beyond furthered this mistake by restricting you to the Psychic Beam, though it attempts to reclaim the original design's strength by implementing elemental shots. Unaware to a player, these shots are functionally a different type of missile. The reason players see shots as missile replacements instead of different beams is simple. You always have access to the Psychic Beam. When you switch to any shot, whether it's the fire, ice, or thunder shot, you don't sacrifice your access to Psychic Beam. Instead, you sacrifice your access to missiles. It's a minor detail that ruins what the game is trying to mimic: dynamic weapon choice. It was likely made in the name of ease of use, or in emulating Metroid Prime hunters, though I can't say for sure. This even extends to the beam combos. Early games had them, later games threw them away for being too complex. They usually required a large investment of time and missiles. Echoes mixed it up a little by requiring an obscene amount of beam ammo for these combos. Prime has some interesting ideas, such as the Wave Buster and Flamethrower, though one deals too little damage while the other is too unusable. Corruption did away with them entirely. Instead of having beam combos, Hyper Missile was made. Just enter Hyper Mode and use a missile. No difficulty, no time investment. The only cost was energy, which you don't even register because it's obfuscated while in Hyper Mode. The bar you consume also starts to fill over time, further minimizing the perceived cost. Beyond tries again to recapture the idea of beam combos by allowing you to charge your missiles and shots. Again, it fails, mainly because missiles and shots were given their own form of charge beam. There's no interaction with Psychic Beam or Power Beam. Speaking of ammo, the system seen in Echoes is great. Making ammo specific to each individual beam, then having light or dark ammo drop when you use the opposite beam was a great design choice. Starting with 50 ammo and also having beam ammo expansions increase your capacity by another 50 was also brilliant. It meant you'd always see a noticeable increase in your beam capacity even when you reach the maximum of 250. Beam ammo expansions being rare as icing on the cake. There's only one for each region, encouraging players to explore every region to its fullest. It could be hidden in light or dark aether, so it's never easy to find till you know exactly where to look. Contrast this with Beyond's attempt at shot ammo, seemingly the same but very different. Each shot uses the same pool of ammo, and ammo can drop in all scenarios, even if you don't need any. There's nothing interesting of managing the ammo of each different shot type. The capacity upgrades feel disappointing in comparison as well, as getting 10 or 20 more ammo doesn't mean much. It's too gradual. Throw in the fact that the maximum capacity is 550. Once you pass 150 shot ammo, the upgrade feels mediocre, meaningless even. It is too small to matter to you, even if the extra ammo might come in handy once or twice later on. The early levels are the best. They feel like Metroid levels. Areas you explore and come back to repeatedly, not only so you can find what you've missed, but because every area has something you'll need to come back for to progress. More importantly, they're full of elements that make navigating them more complex, or at least interesting, such as water or acid that directs you in a certain way. You can walk through the water or acid if you don't mind being slower or taking damage, but there's a cost to ignoring it. And then there's the items, the pickups. Because you're going through most rooms repeatedly, you never need to go out of your way to find one. Yes, you'll need to look for them as the path to reach them, or the items themselves are hidden in plain sight. But you'll never feel like you're wasting time when you're gathering them, especially because at the end of the game, there's a collection of items you need to collect. These are, of course, the artifacts and the Sky Temple keys. The original Metroid Prime is especially good at this, hiding items in and behind what look like solid walls. They require different approaches that aren't always obvious at a first glance. You could need the missile, a power bomb, or even some industrial equipment in the world. In short, obstacles between you and an expansion make them feel rewarding. The more work you need to put into them, the better it feels to find them. Take, for example, an early energy tank in Metroid Prime, the one hidden in the furnace that leads to the Chozo altar, where you should fight your first Chozo ghost. In the early game, you have no reason to go there. You have no reason to do the short puzzle to lower the acid and raise the platforms. If you do it and journey deeper, you'll find the item. There's no suggestion it's there, but it feels good to find. And it feels good to find because there's an invisible theme of exploration. You're rewarded for further exploring an area you've seemingly already completed. Compare that to any item found within Beyond, where exploration is absent. Every item in Beyond is only hidden behind an equipment check. Rarely are they a skill check or a reward for going somewhere you don't need to go. Instead, they're a reward for going somewhere you have no reason to go. A second time. You always need to go back to an area for cleanup, to gather what you couldn't before. Not because you need to get something later. Heck, there's even bots that will mark items on your map, completely ruining any chance you have of exploring an area to the fullest. That's reserved for the Volt Forge, to further the usefulness of the viola, which isn't good, but I'll get back to that later. Levels designed around water are an odd, but particularly important strength of Metroid. The gravity suit has always been a standout piece of Samus's equipment, much like the Varia suit, and it is synonymous with water. Removing the gravity suit and water levels, or any stand-ins that function similarly, remove a core element that players may not consciously expect, but will notice missing. It also throws away a perfect excuse to add interesting mechanics, like the gravity booster did in Echoes. Access to a jetpack while underwater was a great and interesting twist for moving through water. There's no reason it can't be used again. In short, when levels are designed from the ground up with the intent of a player returning, with upgrades playing a factor in spots you don't expect, Metroid Prime is at its greatest. It, along with a webbed layout, feed into the game's core aspect of exploration. When this is applied to every region, so the game is interconnected with shortcuts and dynamic environments that may affect one another, levels feel fun to explore. A player's return needs to be a consideration in both the level's design and how its music sounds. The mood of an area shouldn't change just because Samus fixed or broke something. When it comes to bosses, foes that aren't just beam sponges work best, creatures that have a gimmick to make them vulnerable or to do damage to them. That twist always ensures they're fun to fight, but a key detail that needs to remain is that the scan visor should give you direction on how to approach a boss. This is vital for bosses specifically, as they're best as one-and-done foes. Minimal story is ideal for Metroid Prime. The more dialogue, exposition, and cutscenes there are, the more the game will drag itself down. This is because it's a very gameplay-focused game. There are times for dialogue, exposition, and cutscenes, of course, but they shouldn't interrupt that gameplay. When implemented, story works best when given in isolated chunks, when you experience it after completing a region, or in Corruption's case, a planet. While Echoes, Corruption, and Beyond all implement story, only Echoes does so properly. Any background information that adds context to the story is done in the opening moments, within the tutorial section before you meet Umos. The rest are just guideposts, so you know where to go next. If a player wants more details, they can find them in logbook entries. They find them by scanning. It requires intentional player engagement. If they're not interested, they can hastily scan the entries and never read them, or just walk on by. But as I've said before, the absolutely most critical thing that makes Metroid Prime work is the feeling of exploration. Not just the act of landing on an unknown planet. That's important, of course, but it's only a surface detail. I mean, both Metroid and Super Metroid take place on Zevis. When I say it needs that feeling of exploration, I mean the game needs to make sure that you're focused on the environment, how it's laid out, in looking for things that are hidden within it. The easiest way to achieve this is through minimalism, taking away elements on the HUD that don't need to be on the screen always. Being without some of these may make playing harder. Other ways are to reduce the number of characters, of factions you deal with. Isolation, resisting the urge to help the player, even if they're taking longer than you think they should to do something. That last one's probably the most important one, as both Corruption and Beyond fail to do even that, forcing hints before you can even reach the objective at most times. Guiding the player to things, giving them a pinpoint to try and find a way to, isn't bad. Clearly it works for Prime and Echoes. Those games only give you a destination, not a route. This is enhanced by the very nature of each region's overall design. There's multiple routes to each room for these two games. Sometimes the most straightforward route isn't an option. It's easy for the developer to think that's bad, but in Metroid, it's just the opposite. It's very good. The moment you tell them how to reach a point, you're throwing away Metroid Prime's X factor. The game works best when all you have is a destination. No checkpoints, no hints, just exploring, finding the way there. Even providing a map via a map room is okay, so long as it's not only hidden, but entirely optional. The environment doesn't need to be a literal maze, just the opposite in fact. But the region, when taken as a whole, it needs to be a web to give the player multiple possible paths. It's even better if there's paths they can't take yet or that are only one way. It's obvious that at its core, this is what makes Metroid Prime great, and it sucks that it's so easy to lose. And this is for a number of reasons. For one, Nintendo claims the series is a first-person adventure game, but it's not. That's misleading. The public does this too, as it's most easily described as a first-person shooter, an FPS with Metroid elements. That'll tell anyone what the game should look like when being played, but not how it should be designed. No, what Metroid Prime is a Metroidvania FPS. That may sound like it's semantic difference that doesn't really matter, and to a player that's true. It is a semantic difference to a player, but the difference matters during development. It changes where priorities are placed. An FPS or an FPA would focus on direct levels with tons of guidance that you can't get lost in. But Metroid needs to have little direction. It needs to have unconventional, unforeseen solutions, like in Super Metroid, how you can use an endless bomb jump to fight Kraid before you get the high jump. There are a lot of things that don't work for Metroid Prime. I'm going to try and avoid talking about things I already mentioned, like the static beams seen in Corruption, like ammo as it is in Beyond, or like the lack of exploration. I'll talk about what definitely doesn't work. There's a lot to choose from, just looking at the levels even. By that, I mean linear levels. Those don't work outside of a small tutorial area, where the player is expected to learn the controls and get a feel for the gameplay. These started to appear outside of the tutorial with Corruption, when the game started to lean more into the FPS and FPA genre. Beyond doubled down on them. There's nothing interesting about walking through a linear level. Worse, when I say walk, I mean literally walk through these levels. In Beyond especially, very little is done to bring in platforming, to make it so you don't just walk through levels. Some shortcuts exist and some rooms are built around platforming, yes, but there's nothing interesting about any of them. They feel boring despite being new. Then there's the fact that you only need to go through each area twice, once when going in and once when going out. Corruption does a better job with this, but it's especially bad in Beyond. For Corruption, this is largely seen in the secondary and tertiary landing sites. There's at least always something to go back for on each planet, save for Norian unless you need all the power cells. The visits are always brief, and you're encouraged to sidestep the level though. In Beyond, it's much worse. There's only two areas you return to repeatedly in the game, the Volt Forge and the Soul Valley. The Soul Valley is just a massive empty desert, but I'll get back to that later. The Volt Forge, on the other hand, is the go-to when you need an upgrade to progress. You'll do so at least twice, once to upgrade the Viola and once to get the Lightning Shot. You technically visit the Flare Pools and Ice Belt twice, but you stay on the fringes. You never actually enter the main level for both of these areas. Instead, you just stay on the outside, seeing the rest of the level in the distance, taunting you. There's absolutely no reason to go back to either area otherwise, aside from 100%ing the game, of course. This pairs even worse when you remember that Beyond has dynamic levels, quote unquote. The Flare Pools are the most obvious example of this, completely changing once you've finished the area. To the game's credit, if you actually re-enter the level, it's a noticeable difference. But the mood is completely changed. The original song, that's not too bad, is replaced with something so dreary you never want to stay, even though nothing bad actually happened there. Seeing how the other areas are entirely non-dynamic, such as the ice belt that never thaws despite powering the heater, or how the Great Mine magically heals itself after you leave, only makes what we see in the Flare Pools worse. Not only because the Flare Pools are less interesting, but because there's absolutely no consequences to your actions in other areas. There is nothing interesting about returning. You never need to, but a player 100%ing the game will. There's no reward visually for doing so though. This isn't to say that dynamic levels are bad when done well, like it is in the 2D Metroids, Fusion and Dread. Nightmare destroying Sector 5 and Ateria freezing over after a creature blocks the flow of lava in Cataris work really well. It works in Fusion because it happens for the last time you need to go to Sector 5, and the SAX has changed levels repeatedly by destroying doors throughout the game to try and corral you. You also repeatedly return to areas in Fusion. The changes make exploring more interesting as you can't use the same paths. And it works in Dread because it's a temporary obstacle to slow you down after you get the gravity suit. It also helps that both Fusion and Dread don't replace the song that plays for each area with a dreary ambience, instead playing an actual song. Items within the tutorial section that you're forced to grab also don't work. These act as a speed bump in a section the player should be focused on the game, deciding whether or not they even like the gameplay. Item collection is part of the loop, but a guaranteed item is not. Furthermore, picking up items shouldn't need a tutorial. Enemies already drop energy and missiles. A player will be trained to walk into floating things like missile expansions or energy tanks by the time they find one. Another detail about items that don't work is multiple sets you need to collect. In Prime, Echoes, and even Corruption, you only need to collect one set of items to beat the game. In Prime, it's the Chozo artifacts. In Echoes, it's the Sky Temple keys. And in Corruption, it's the power cells. In Beyond, you collect not one, not two, but 3 sets. Keys which are guaranteed through progression, green crystals that are incredibly boring to collect, and mech parts that are almost equally boring to collect. A single set of countable hidden items you need to search for work. Being able to collect them at any time, so long as you can reach them, also works. What doesn't work is getting keys from fighting bosses. Needing to collect an entire map full of crystals, like your Ratchet and Clank trying to fix your ship or get a part for the Hypnomatic. Needing to meander to Federation ruins and collect mech parts you can't grab till endgame. None of those work. Why? Well, for one, none of them respect the player's time. For two, they aren't Metroid objectives. They're chores, and you don't need to search. You just wander. Side characters also hurt Metroid Prime as a game. Specifically, I mean side characters who aren't rivals, adversaries, or bosses later on. Characters like Mackenzie, Tokabi, Duke, and Armstrong. These side characters only serve to hurt the sense that Samus is isolated and alone. Even if they're useful, even if they're likable, even if they're intended to give a payoff to the game's conclusion, they will only slow the game down, especially if that payoff never comes. This is especially bad since Metroid Prime is a gameplay-focused game, as I mentioned before. Story needs to take a back seat. Compare this to how Corruption approaches side characters. Rundus, Gore, and Gandrada are all Samus's rivals. Every single one of them has a payoff in the form of a boss fight. They're introduced so the player has an opinion of them, and to establish their relationship with Samus. They're used to further Samus and to provide context to what she may be thinking later without explicitly telling you. Not to pad the game or give direction. Each one has 3 scenes. A first impression, observing and talking to them in the field, then the fight. No more is needed. Echoes does even better than Corruption with side characters. They have singular scenes, existing to reinforce the world Samus is exploring and the danger the Ing pose. They may provide redundant information, but they are all in a supporting role that doesn't take away from the game. Cutting either the Luminoth holograms or the Federation troopers in Echoes would actually hurt the game because they're so minimal, and nothing else does the same task. The streamlining of combat also hurts Metroid Prime. A simpler way to think of this is simple combat. It doesn't work. I already mentioned ammo, how Beyond lets shots use all the same larger pool of ammo, and how more smaller expansions don't work when comparing it to Echoes' ammo system. But where else does streamlining combat hurt Metroid Prime? Well, weaknesses for one. A simple, bare-bones weakness system hurts the game. Beyond has a very basic one. Shots typically don't do more damage against foes. Instead, they're vulnerable to the passive effects of each shot. Bots allegedly take more damage from Thundershot, but in truth, they're weak to Ice Shot because it stops them from moving and attacking. Fire Shot does more damage against the Ice Wolves, sure, but everything else might burn and take damage over time. There's no guarantee they will. Flying enemies will all shatter due to Ice Shot because they will fall, which feels bad. It isn't rewarding as you don't need to do anything else to shatter them. There's no satisfaction for completing a combo that makes them shatter. There's no potential tactical decision to freeze a flying foe to temporarily disable them without shattering them to deal with them later. Compare that to Echoes, where every enemy is weak to either light or dark beam. It ties in with the game's theme, its motif. It isn't just satisfied with leaving it at that either. An enemy's weakness changes if an Ing possesses it. There are also enemies that have shielding that protects them from either light or dark beam. They can switch that shielding at any time. Exploiting an enemy's weakness makes you deal a lot more damage. To put it simply, Echoes using ammo feels like a fair trade. Use a limited resource to deal devastating damage. Meanwhile, in Beyond, using ammo feels like you're using an elemental psychic beam that has limited shots. Echoes feels great, Beyond feels boring. Corruption also makes this mistake with streamlining combat. Beams were removed in favor of hyper mode. No enemy has weaknesses. Instead, enemies have very little HP or a ton of HP. There are only beam sponges, hyper mode, and you. What upgrades do exist for your arm cannon are functionally utility upgrades, not changing how powerful you feel outside of hyper mode. The closest the game has to a weakness are vulnerabilities, specifically to Ice Missile or Nova Beam mixed with the X-Ray Visor. Making very obvious, visible weak points also streamlines combat. Every boss has this same basic gimmick in Beyond. Shoot at the glowing weak point till it breaks. Every main boss has one, on account of them experiencing Metroid fusion off-camera. It's incredibly basic and uninteresting. The closest it gets to mixing this up is with the boss in the Great Mines, where the weak point to make it vulnerable shrinks as it moves faster, forcing you to aim more and more ahead. It's boring, it's uninteresting, it's bland, it's uncreative. There's no need to scan any boss and learn what makes it tick. Just shoot the glowy points till it pops. Creative bosses have always been Metroid Prime's bread and butter. You encounter something new and need to scan it to get a hint on how to hurt it. Like with the Parasite Queen, scanning it changes where your lock-on aims, drastically increasing the damage you deal. The Grapple Guardian needs to be scanned so you can shoot its eye, get it to grapple to a pole, and shoot its rear. And while Helios' scan doesn't reveal much, it isn't as simple as rapidly shoot the glowing points to beat it because it uses a swarm to roll around, shoot sonic blasts, shoot lasers, and even crush you. Also compare how Beyond's bosses have multiple weak points to Thardos in the original. It also has multiple weak points you need to break. The differences being that only one is active at a time, and you can't see which one's vulnerable with the basic visor at first. Where Beyond's implementation is bland and boring, Prime's is much more interesting. It feels challenging and fun despite not featuring Beyond's new aiming mechanic. It's things like this that make using Morph Ball to dodge attacks in Beyond the standout feature of its combat. It's at least a new mechanic that hasn't been seen before in Metroid Prime. You usually have little time to react, and it is something Samus has done before, albeit only in cutscenes and Super Smash Bros. It doesn't slow down combat while adding much needed depth to a shallow sea. The Morph Ball dodging can even be contrasted with the bombing runs of Corruption. That too is a simple action that makes sense. Since Samus can control her ship, she should be able to call it in to do a bombing run. But it doesn't work nearly as well because you can only use it in certain rooms, against certain enemies. While it's simple and fast, it is very restricted, usable only in certain scenarios. Heck, the game doesn't even introduce bombing runs to you. You're just expected to know they exist because there's ship missile expansions. For almost 20 years, those were the most useless pickup to me because I never noticed bombing runs even existed. I bring up the bombing runs because it's not the simplicity that's the problem, it is the streamlining. If Corruption were designed so you were mostly outside, so you could almost always have access to the bombing runs, it'd be a good feature, a card to play when things aren't going your way. It'd be even more interesting if ship missile ammo never dropped, if instead of enemies dropping it randomly when they die, you had to return to where you get the upgrade to reload. Suddenly you need to manage it. The mechanic becomes much better instantly because it's not streamlined. It'd be even better if hyper mode was a lot more dangerous, so you would use these bombing runs more often. But the biggest thing that doesn't work in Metroid Prime on any level, that's vehicles. They don't work. Every time they're in a Metroid Prime, they hurt the game, in gameplay and in level design. Thankfully, vehicles have only been seen twice that I know of, in Corruption and Beyond. Corruption's use is the most basic and forgiving. It's Samus's gunship. It is primarily used to fast travel across planets and between planets. The intention behind it is, of course, to streamline gameplay, to remove that boring task of navigating the world they built. It is functionally a universal elevator that acts the same as a save and ammo room, a 3-in-1 utility, if you will. Corruption's gunship mainly hurts level design, not so much gameplay. It did so in subtle ways that's there if you look. Instead of designing one area of interconnected paths, a region whose map looks like a web and may be hard to read or interesting to navigate, it caused Retro Studios to design planets in sections. It reduced the areas where they could hide upgrades, meaning there's less interesting spots to find them. That, in turn, made finding upgrades less rewarding. It makes traveling between two objectives, say from one shield generator to the other on Brio, far more boring than it would be in, say, Echoes. In Echoes, after collecting the planetary energy from Dark Aether, you travel to the same temple in Light Aether. It's like walking back and forth, but it feels better because you're platforming. You're actually playing the game rather than walking to a loading screen, watching the loading screen, then walking to the next objective, where you might encounter some enemies on the way. Beyond's Viola is far more egregious. It is something straight out of a racing game. If Metroid Prime Beyond were a spin-off, say a racing game where Samus needs to compete in a tournament to catch a bounty a la F-Zero's Captain Falcon, I'd probably enjoy the Viola. That sounds like a good spin-off I'd be interested in. Could do a lot of things with that concept that Metroid and Metroid Prime can't do. Please, tell me more. The problem is, Metroid Prime Beyond isn't a spin-off. It isn't another Metroid Prime pinball. It is a Metroidvania FPS, built like an FPS, not a racing game. Not only does riding the viola completely change your controls, not only does it completely change the gameplay loop, not only is it used for the most boring objective in the game, not only does it make all the same mistakes that Star Fox Zero makes, but it's functionally a loading screen for loading screens. A loading screen that was forced into an otherwise acceptable entry in the Metroid Prime series. Beyond's certainly not the best, not by a long shot, but it is at least Metroid Prime at its core when you're not on the viola. That's a lot of flamboyant language, but it doesn't really state how it could possibly ruin the gameplay or level design. So let's start with gameplay. How does the viola ruin it? Well, as I said, it's functionally a loading screen for loading screens. You only use it to hold A and drive through a giant desert, to drive around the Volt Forge, to glide over lava in the flare pool. While in the desert, there's a chance these wheels or these birds will start rolling or flying around you, firing missiles, but fighting them is clunky at best. You fight enemies like you do in Star Fox Zero. You stop looking at the road in front of you and aim at the enemies. In other words, it's texting while driving, the video game, all over again. Oh, and traveling across the desert doesn't mean that when you reach your destination, there's no loading screen. It isn't used to cover those up. They're still there, taking quite a while on the Switch 1. As for how the viola ruins level design, well, the Soul Valley is literally a desert. I constantly call it the Soul Desert by mistake because it ain't a valley. It is flat, there is no platforming. It is the furthest you can get from a Metroid Prime level. There is nothing to do within it other than drive through green crystals and collect mech parts, both of which are a bore to gather, but must be gathered to beat the game. And don't get me started on Tokabi finding items for you. To steal the joy of finding items within the desert, an already bad level, it's like someone developing the game thought that finding items was a chore, that the very act is boring, so they took the initiative to fix it. A core mechanic of Metroid. Then, in the flare pools, it takes a perfectly good natural barrier that could be overcome with the psychic boost ball and replaces it with a small viola section. You already need it to progress further in the level, plus it's used to gather a shot expansion in the same room as the viola section. But instead, you need to use a hard-to-control upgrade for the viola that exists to replace the Pariah suit upgrade. And in the Volt Forge, it took what could have been a masterful vertically designed level with multiple connections and made it a circular racetrack, where you race nothing and have speed bumps. Every time you use the viola, you will not be playing the game you bought. You'll be playing another worse game without any good levels. Heck, without any levels. Things were made for it to have a purpose. Things that make the game worse to play, to explore, that make it a painful experience. I could keep going, but I'd start repeating myself. Vehicles don't work in Metroid Prime. The gameplay loop completely changes when Samus is in one, and not for the better. And adding one always forces its way into the game's level design philosophy, degrading it so it can't play like a Metroid game. It is fundamentally opposed to the series. There are more things that can ruin my Metroid Prime that will make the game worse, but thankfully they haven't been added. Yet. If you can think of one I missed, I'd love to read it in the comments, but these are the biggest points of failure the series has seen so far. They are a good lesson for anyone who might want to get into game development, on how a simple choice to change a mechanic or to add a mechanic will reverberate throughout the game. Even something you think is small and simple, like how a player interacts with what should still be multiple beams, shrinking the impact of an upgrade and making more of them. Or how a quality of life feature like fast travel, even when limited to certain locations and certain rooms, can ruin the end result. So why are the GameCube versions the best? Why is Metroid Prime my favorite and Echoes a very close second? In my reviews, I have nothing but praise for Echoes, but the original takes the case and I never go into why. The best answer I have is admittedly a cop-out, because they have the sauce. They have an X factor that later games failed to replicate. They understand what they are the best. Obviously, the sauce, or X factor in Prime and Echoes' case, is the sense of exploration. Both games excel at it. It's the main reason these two games are so good. But there are other reasons. Smaller, but more obvious reasons that give Prime and Echoes that sense of exploration, like the level design, the music, the visors, and their beam matching mechanics. The level design is the most important. They were made using a completely different rulebook when compared to later entries. They're designed like webs. Each region is an interconnected network of rooms. You're intended to go through every room multiple times during the visit, and they're laid out so you need to parkour through almost every room. In Prime, hazards are used to encourage you to take the path they intend, while in Echoes, levels are better designed so you need to parkour to move forward. Both approaches work, but Prime allowing you to choose to ignore the hazards and just go through them, damage be damned, makes it a little bit better. This approach to levels means there's a lot more areas players will be frequenting to hide items in, whether they be a simple corridor or an actual room with platforming. Prime is willing to go above and beyond, hiding items in walls that don't appear breakable in any way, while Echoes makes breakable surfaces more obvious and more sparse. Prime does better with where items are hidden, but Echoes does a better job at creating challenges to get some upgrades. All of them really test your skills better than Prime ever does. The Morph Ball sections are also better in Prime and Echoes than later titles. They aren't afraid to use the Morph Ball in a 3D environment, to have a player free ball a section without any guardrails. Both Prime and Echoes have a memorable test for the Morph Ball, with a reward at its end. Prime has the magnetic rail that leads to the plasma beam. If you fall from the top of the room to the absolute bottom, welcomed by lava usually. If you get too fancy with your spider ball usage, you'll fall to your proverbial doom. There's also the rail in Fendrana's Pirate Lab. If you do it when you first arrive, you can see the rail and it's pretty easy, but if you wait too long, it's in utter darkness, making it much harder, both in terms of skill and psychologically. Echoes' Morph Ball section is in an area you never need to go in Light Aether. In some ways, it's easier than any Morph Ball section in Prime, as it's mostly a spider ball timing test. But there is a section where an enemy you can't fight from the ground is lurking. It'll grab you and drop you, making it incredibly annoying if you don't have access to the power bomb. It's not as interesting as it could be, but it does switch between the 2D and the 3D. Then there's how each region is connected. Unlike Corruption, where the ship allows you to travel to any landing pad you've discovered on any planet, or Beyond, where there's only one path in and out of each region, save for the Soul Valley, which is connected to everywhere, Prime and Echoes have hard links. Just like how every region is a web of connections, the regions themselves are connected like a web. The connections in Echoes are predictable and easy to use, as the levels don't sprawl as much as they do in Prime. They're much more compact. In Prime, they're more sporadic and don't follow any clear convention, though they are connected if you look at the overall map of the world. The levels being much wider doesn't help the problems Prime sees either. The music of both Prime and Echoes really aid the game's feeling, the mood, and the vibe of each area. They not only match their regions really well, enhancing the immersion in the game, but they reinforce sub-areas in areas like the Torvus Bog and the Fendrana Drifts. Prime does a much better job with the music, if you ask me. It has good music more consistently, and its music always fits the environment in more ways than one. Visors also aid in why Prime and Echoes are so great. They change the environments you're in, both in gameplay and visually. The thermal visor does this by revealing power conduits, so you can enable things while revealing cloaked pirates. The X-ray visor does this by letting you see through non-solid walls, revealing potentially hidden paths or items, while also making it easier to track the Chozo ghosts. The dark visor simply reveals platforms and switches, and the Echo visor is very similar, revealing sonic switches. Obviously, Prime does a better job than Echoes, as there's simply more variety in what the visors do and their use cases. They better aid in the sense of exploration. That said, the aesthetic, the visual changes of the visors in Echoes are better. As for beam matching, it keeps the player engaged by simply existing. Needing to switch beams for doors or to better fight some enemies keeps the player paying attention. Even if you memorize an environment to the point where going through it is autonomic, you need to decide at what point you switch beams. Is it when you enter the room, when you can see the door, or when you're close to that door? Depending on the situation, the answer's always different. The enemies in Prime who are only vulnerable to one beam, such as the Chozo Ghosts, the Beam Pirates, and the Fission Metroids, make sure you're familiar with how to use each beam, and makes it so you can't just rely on one during the end game. It works, but isn't as good as Echoes, where your usage of each beam is limited. Where there are enemies with shielding, you need to switch beams to break. Where the different beams are not only much more powerful, but where weaknesses mean something. It makes Light, Dark, and Annihilator Beam feel special, something that Prime, Corruption, and Beyond all lack. For me, Prime beats out Echoes as my favorite because of the levels, the music, and the visors. It feels the closest to Metroid that the Metroid Prime series can be. It's the least afraid of the Morph Ball. It's always willing to use it in 3D, offering no safeguards to make it easier to use. Everything in Prime feels right. The first game also changes itself as you reach the home stretch. When you reach the point where almost nothing can threaten you, it introduces a new type of space pirate. The Power, Wave, Ice, and Plasma Pirates, or as I like to call them, the Beam Pirates. You need to use the right beam to fight them. It is everything a 3D Metroid should be. But don't get me wrong, Echoes is more refined. It is the better game of the two games. It doesn't always do well with immersion, the music doesn't always pull you in as well as it could. There's also a few bosses towards the end which could use some more work, as they were built around the Morph Ball. But overall, it's a deeper, funner game with a tight design that reflects itself. Even though you'll be repeating the same objective again and again, it'll always feel different. Corruption is a good game, in a vacuum. It has elements that feel like good ideas initially, but that hurt the game overall. One of these is the simplification of beams. I distinctly remember thinking when the game first came out, when I played it for the first time, that being able to open any door I have the beam for was great. I didn't need to switch beams constantly. I could just play the game. Of course, then I played it again, and again. It felt worse each time. I didn't need to think while playing. Why would I? There's just one beam and it just works. The game is also constantly telling me what to do. Then there's the moment you realize Hyper Mode is essentially a God Mode toggle, and combat begins to feel shallow. You never need to use any of the upgrades for Hyper Mode either. The only upgrade you might use is the Hyper Grapple, and that's for one part of the game. All the other upgrades are for destroying obstacles, not fighting enemies. Even if they were for fighting enemies, they're boring mechanically. Going all in with the story was a decent decision for Corruption. The game is the climax to the Metroid Prime trilogy. It's a fitting climax that works best when you look at the beginning and the end. It needs more confrontations between Samus and Dark Samus, but it does decently enough. Its biggest problem is how the story is told, through the Aurora units. You're told everything. Worse, sometimes you see something, then are told about it immediately, like you weren't paying attention. It's repetitive, kinda like some of my videos. Breaking the grapple beam into multiple upgrades wasn't the worst of ideas, but the order you get each upgrade feels wrong. Honestly, the rate and place you unlock every upgrade feels wrong. You get Screw Attack, a famously endgame ability, in the middle of the game. You get Ice Missiles halfway into the planet right after Missiles. Then you get even more missiles for your ship, immediately afterwards. The ship missiles are literally right after Ice Missiles. Oh, and you get Hyper Mode right after the tutorial. Not where an ability that is best described as God Mode should be obtained. The Morph Ball is all but forgotten in Corruption. It's seemingly used exclusively for going through pipes or for 2D sections. Boost Ball's best feature, the half pipes, are rarely seen at all. I want to say there's 3 in the entire game. And the Spider Ball sections are needlessly long. Morph Ball is avoided like the plague, except for where they decided to make it as boring as humanly possible. I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention that not as much effort was put into making Corruption as visually interesting as Prime or Echoes. I say that because 2 of the worlds have the same color palette. They're various shades of yellowish orange. The only difference is the accent color. Hyper Mode desaturating the world when you enable it doesn't help things either. It relies on how Bloom was new when it was released. It used that bloom to cover up a lot of blemishes. The game just doesn't look good when compared to what came out years before. Kinda like some modern games these days. And then there's the music. Half of it is generic, incredibly generic. 2 Planets have a good song, but most of the time it's just... The songs don't help you get into the game. They don't aid immersion at all. The only time it gets close is when there's a clash between you, the Federation, and the Space Pirates. But Corruption does do some things right. It tries to make a sort of ultimate test for its final planet. It makes that effort, and the section's one of the better sections, largely because you're racing the clock. If you take too long, you'll generate too much phazon and become corrupted. You can't stop it, only slow it down. Setting it up could be better, but the section itself is good. The way the game handles its characters, outside of the Aurora units, is also a positive. Rundus, Gore, and Gandreda, being rivals you have to fight at some point, works. The fact they have very different personalities that you actually see helps. One is fairly friendly, one's neutral, and one's antagonistic. The order you fight them could be better, but that doesn't mean this doesn't work. The game also does a good job with its final boss fights for each planet. They require a bit of tactics to fight properly. They have sections you need hyper mode for, but are designed so you can't just enter hyper mode and rinse the floor with them. The fights with the other hunters also show potential, with Rundus being the weak link. He alone can be quickly dispatched by hyper mode. And the Metroids are an interesting take. They mix up the usual formula for fighting them. In certain rooms, they can be quite difficult to fight. Their biggest flaw is that you can easily avoid them while they're powerless to stop you. It's easy to trick them into phasing out of reality as they charge you. But it's also easy to get them in a wall so you can't hit them with a missile to freeze them. They're sort of a double-edged sword in that way. Again, an interesting take. It has potential, it just needed more thought, more time. Corruption is the worst of the primes, at least to me. It went from being my favorite Metroid Prime to my least favorite. All it took was the trilogy being released. That led me to replaying the series and realizing its flaws. Maybe not consciously at the time, but I noticed them immediately. In a vacuum, Corruption's a great game, but when put beside another Metroid Prime, it's disappointing. It could have been more. It could have been the finale that was truly great, but it chose not to be. Beyond is an unfortunate case in two main ways. The first is that it was destined to never please players. Not only did it wait too long to enter production, but it was announced to players way too early. People had ample time to build it up, both through the nostalgic lens of how they remembered the originals, and through the rumor mill, as people talked about what they wanted to see, what they wanted the game to be. The second problem is that the original team that worked on Metroid Prime had moved on by the time it was started. The list of people who worked on the original trilogy, let alone the original game, who also worked on Beyond is a very short list, assuming it's not zero. In other words, no one who understood the design of Metroid Prime, Echoes, or even Corruption worked on Beyond. And even if they did, too much time had passed between when Retro Studios finished Corruption and when Retro Studios began work on Beyond. There was too much brain drain, intentional or not. It's sad to say, but to quote New Vegas, truth is, the game was rigged from the start. Beyond could never be what fans expected. And what's worse is that it really tried. It tries to pull the best aspects from each game. You can see it if you look closely enough. Heck, I missed this with my original review because it felt so different. It pulls from Corruption with its high-octane intro during a space pirate attack on a Federation planet. You get a guaranteed energy tank in a morph ball crawl space before the one-off tutorial section's climax. The different shot types in Beyond are just mimicking the elemental nature of Prime's wave, ice, and plasma beam. It pulls beam ammo from Echoes, only every shot uses the same pool. It even has a dead psychic race, like the Luminoth or the Chozo. Only, it's all wrong. The early energy tank in Corruption that was guaranteed was needed because Hyper Mode uses an energy tank when it's activated. You can't use Hyper Mode if you don't have at least 100 energy. You can skip the energy tank on Norian if you want to, so if you didn't get a forced energy tank, you couldn't beat the game. You'd be soft-locked. Prime's beams weren't just elemental, but actually behaved differently from one another with their standard shots. You were also locked into one beam at a time, Mata Beam and Power Beam. Beam ammo in Echoes was not only limited, but in separate pools, so you'd use it sparingly. Replenishing that ammo meant you'd switch between beams, potentially using one that's ineffective to restore the other. And the Chozo could only see glimpses of the future. Meanwhile, the Luminoth were only resistant to Ing possession due to strong mental fortitude. And they weren't quite dead yet. Neither were capable of unimaginable technological feats because psychic. In other words, Beyond is like an incompetent Ditto in Pokemon. When a Ditto uses its only move, Transform, it can copy the look, attacks, and stats of any other Pokemon. I mentioned this to my friends, and they pointed out that all sequels are like this. Well, the good ones are at least. But give me a chance to elaborate. Like a Ditto, Beyond copies the mechanics and design choices of prior games. It copies the look and attacks of Metroid Prime. But unlike Ditto, Beyond didn't copy the logic or reasoning behind the mechanics or design choices. It didn't copy the stats, like attack or special attack. As such, to a developer, to the Ditto transforming, it does everything right. Beyond should be everything a player expects. But to a player, the game will feel off. It isn't as fun as it should be. Some might recognize why, but most won't. And all of this is not to say the game does a bad job with copying what came before. Beyond manages a very convincing imitation, just like a Ditto. It is a competent sequel. even if you give its gameplay or mechanics more than just a glance. It makes a simple mistake, not reflecting on design choices or critically thinking about what makes Metroid Prime in the first place. What the game truly does a bad job with, what the people at Retro Studios who worked on the game failed to recognize or copy, were the levels. The game's environments are built like shooter levels. That's what they were told Metroid Prime is, by Nintendo, by fans, by everyone. It's a first-person adventure game. If someone on the team asked what type of game they were making, they were likely told it's a first-person shooter, only Metroid-themed. Again, I admit that's a decent description. Given enough time, I could make a prototype of what that should play like on that statement alone. I'd know how its levels should look and that its combat should be a focus. It's a shooter after all, right? By the very nature of the game always being described with first person as the first words people hear, their brain will always autocorrect to first-person shooter. And what do FPS campaigns look like? They're linear. There are no side paths, rarely any doubling back, and have a lot of walking. As I quoted earlier, the game was rigged from the start. Of course, then there's the game's black sheep, just like with Superman Lives, a movie that would have starred Nicolas Cage but was never made. Someone in charge got an idea stuck in their head, an idea that is antithetical to what they were trying to make. For Superman, it was a giant spider that would one day be seen in Wild Wild West. For Metroid Prime Beyond, it's the viola. This motorcycle doesn't fit within the game. It is single-handedly the worst thing in the game. It is not Metroid. And like a poison brought with a spider's bite, the viola crept into other parts of the game, just so the thing is useful, not a pointless upgrade. An entire empty region was added for it to frolic in. It'd be good in a racing spin-off, but not a Metroid Prime. But enough about the motorcycle. It adds nothing, and that's that. I railed against it enough earlier. I mentioned combat's good, because it is. Despite the game's shortcoming, it knows how to make combat engaging. It does this by amping everything's damage up to 11, by making sure you can't even take it easy. The only problem is that basic enemies are far more dangerous than bosses. You're much more likely to die to a basic Griever or one of the Lemorne bots than you are Silex. The charged missiles and shots are interesting, but I prefer the beam combos of prior games. Needing to charge a beam means you have an out if you need it. Beam combos need additional time investment, so it works out. It also means that your charge beam never feels irrelevant like it does in Beyond, due to the strength of normal shots from your psychic beam. The second level of charge for the shots and missiles in Beyond are a nice sentiment, but what it really does is just make the middle first tier not that good. This will be a problem no matter what you do with this system, because no matter how powerful tier 1 is, the tier 2 charge will always feel more powerful. It needs something else to be good, like blending beam combos. Ice and fire shot being blended would be very interesting. The story is also very unsatisfying. The characters, even if I like a few of them, don't add anything to the rest of the game. The ending they exist for is hollow. Honestly, the game would be better if it was tweaked so none of them existed in the first place. The only payoff they can provide is in a future game, where they've been infested with fusion Metroids. That name sounds wrong. Another example of the game's bad naming, which I railed on in the original review. Then there's the music. Beyond shouldn't have as much good music as Corruption, especially since it has less music meant for dealing with large events beyond Samus, like the eternal Space Pirate Federation war that seems to be going on. It needs to have more than 2 or 3 good songs. The Morph Ball has 2 halves, the half that's good and the half that's bad. The good half is the Spider Ball. I genuinely enjoy the new spider tethers. They're a great addition. The Boost Ball's circular spinner is much better than the ones in Corruption, and using the Morph Ball to dodge, chef's kiss. But then there's everything else. There's a few places where you use the Morph Ball for a 2D section. Usually you roll through a pipe. The 2D sections that do exist are very boring. They're very straightforward. They don't change and aren't interesting. The only one that is interesting is in the flare pool, where the mech part is hidden, and even that one still falls flat. It's a shame that Beyond fumbles as much as it does. It still is a decent game, a step above Corruption for me. But the viola isn't just a rough spot. It's a razor's edge determined to ruin the whole experience. It can be best described as an average Metroid Prime, worthy of being a sequel, a successor to Metroid Prime, but it's not worthy of being in the top 3 for the series. So, how should you make a new Metroid Prime, or any new Metroidvania FPS? It's easy to think you just need to copy Metroid Prime 2 Echoes and call it a day, but that'd only get you pretty close. It's definitely a good plan, but you'd run the risk of making all the same mistakes that Beyond did. mistakes that are easy to avoid if you understand the reasons behind the design. The first and most important element you need to get right is the level design. Metroidvanias, regardless of being 2D or 3D, live and die by their levels. They cannot succeed as linear adventures with straight lines and a bunch of walking. The world needs to be full of rooms where you need to platform, where skill plays a factor in moving forward. Doing otherwise ensures that when it comes time to place hidden items, there won't be any good hiding spots. Naturally, this means you need a lot of larger rooms, but there can be corridors too, rooms that exist solely for connecting these larger rooms. They're easy to forgive because they're not only like a loading screen, but also allow for more freedom in designing the main set pieces, the parts players play for fun. If you want to go above and beyond with corridors, you can add platforming to them, use them as dedicated morph ball sections, or if you're particularly clever, you can work them into one of the large set piece rooms. Just make sure that initially, that corridor isn't part of that room. Keep them isolated at first. Dynamic elements are another important aspect to include in every region. Each region needs enemies and environmental hazards. These don't necessarily need to be dangerous, they only need to hinder you like water would. Enemies are the easiest to include, making it tempting to just add more enemies and forgo hazards. Don't make this mistake though, you need both. The reason you need both is because enemies can be dealt with, giving player free rein to do what they want in a room. A natural hazard like water or lava can't be removed, at least not without an upgrade. It makes it so a player can't just turn off their brain and encourages level designers to not just make a straight, boring path with a few enemies to meet a quota. A focus on hazards and platforming being in every room also helps with item placement. Items need to be hidden, not necessarily out of view, but the way to get them can't be obvious or easy. That means hiding them behind an optional puzzle players can ignore, placing them behind a destructible wall that blends in, taunting players with an expansion behind a grate with no clear path to it. All of these are great ways to hide an item, and hiding items properly is important, especially for Metroidvanias that take after Metroid. And as a last note for level design, you want each region to be a sort of web. Every large, set-piece room that players spend most of their time in should be connected to an average of 3 other rooms. Similarly, the world's regions need to be interconnected to one another, not just a hub region, but to each other, possibly even at multiple points, like the Talon overworld is to the Chozo ruins. This will make multiple paths for players to take, making it unclear which is the faster way is what you want to strive for. There shouldn't be a clear, fastest route. The second most important thing is the combat. It needs to be smooth and fast-paced, but it also needs to be a bit odd when compared to a traditional FPS. By this, I mean weapons need to have clear strengths and weaknesses. They can't be clones of one another like they are in Beyond and Corruption. This means some fire a lot faster or a lot slower. They also need to do something surprising. By this, I mean they have to have a trait, like how Wave and Ice Beam both can stun an enemy in Metroid Prime. Wave Beam has a short stun and tracks its enemies to ensure it hits, while Ice Beam has a long stun, with no tracking and a slow projectile. I'll put it another way. The power of a weapon should be proportional to how hard it is to use. Power Beam is always super easy to use, so it should be the weakest. Ice Beam, at least for me, has always been the hardest to use, so it should be one of the strongest. If you throw ammo into the mix, remember to account for limited ammo and how powerful that weapon is, and make sure that getting ammo requires effort. Don't make it hard, just don't make it as simple as every enemy drops ammo. Enemies can't be singular in design. In other words, you can't have 5 different versions of the same enemy, like with Grievers in Beyond or the Space Pirates in Corruption. Mechanically, these enemies are copies of one another. Beyond is the worst offender because it replaces them with upgraded versions throughout the game. It's very obvious. Fighting one enemy shouldn't be the same as fighting another. The difference between 2 enemies should never be health and damage. That gets boring fast, even more fast in a Metroidvania FPS. So how should enemies be instead? Well, they need to behave differently. They need to have different weapons, different attacks, different designs. As an example, if in Corruption there were 3 tiers of Space Pirate, one lightly armored that has a shield that's always on, one medium armored with a grenade launcher, and one that's heavily armored with a machine gun, things would be fine. Enemies can pull from the same basic attack types, such as a single projectile, a volley of projectiles, a scatter shot of projectiles, a bite, a ram, fire breath, you name it. They just need to have different combinations of attacks, different designs, and different weaknesses. Speaking of weaknesses, you need to be very careful with resistances and immunities. There needs to be some sort of signal that a particular weapon isn't working that anyone can pick up on. not just you. As an example, when an enemy is immune to a beam in Metroid Prime, your beam will either go through that enemy or it will bounce off it. It's a lot harder to signal to a player when an enemy resists an attack unless you start showing numbers, which you shouldn't do. It'll clutter the HUD and takes away from the exploration the genre benefits from. On to the smaller, less wide things you need to get right. Mobility upgrades are far more valuable than weapon upgrades, so make sure you include them. This is more true for Metroid specifically, but matters for all Metroidvanias. Things like the Morph Ball, high jump boots, space jump, grapple beam, and even the X-ray visor all make a much larger impact on gameplay than wave, ice, and plasma beam. And the reason is fairly simple. They enhance the player's ability to explore. They expand the player's horizon. The beams open more doors, yes, but they don't change the gameplay. Mobility upgrades also keep gameplay fresh, as levels become more and less complex. New routes appear, as do new shortcuts. They keep the player engaged for longer than a new shiny weapon ever will. This is also why combat needs to feel good right out of the box. No upgrade will ever make a huge impact. If it does, players will hate combat until they get that upgrade. I've mentioned it a few times, but story and cutscenes aren't important to the Metroidvania FPS genre. It's why a scan system works really well, and why you should include one. It allows the story and the world to be built up without getting in the game's way. It also acts as a hidden hint system, offering guidance to players who may need it and want it. Players who enjoy lore and story will read, while players who don't care won't. All you need to do is make sure players know the inciting incident, why you are there. A bigger story can be told, it just can't interrupt the game, so be careful. You'll want saving to be isolated to special rooms. These rooms can restore health like save stations in Metroid Prime, but they shouldn't restore ammo like they do in Beyond. They also shouldn't be too frequent or too sparse. There's a moving sweet spot that's dependent on the region, how difficult it's supposed to be, and at what point in the game you should be exploring it. You want to do this so failure is punished properly. I know, obvious, but we live in an age where more devs think games should be forgiving than not. Failure, a game over screen, is good. When saving is sparse, progress is more valuable, and failing hurts a lot more. It encourages players to not only get better at the game, but also encourages a player to take a break when they need it. The less frequently they save, the more they'll want that break. Just make sure you place save rooms near bosses. I'm saying rare saves, not cruel saves. As for why you don't want to restore ammo with these save stations, the answer is simple. It should be a limited resource. If ammo is restored at every save station, it's not limited. Not really. By making ammo rarer, it feels more valuable, so players only use it when they need it. It also means a weapon that uses ammo can be more powerful, so players feel like they need it and that it's valuable. It adds depth and tactics to another part of the game that wouldn't be there if you allowed save rooms to restore ammo. If you implement two kinds of ammo, make sure their capacity upgrades feel like they experience different kinds of growth. In other words, make one that has a lot of small upgrades that build up over time, and one that has a few large upgrades that make you feel immediately stronger. The reason is so neither feels like a filler or time sink upgrade. If you want a time sink ammo upgrade, just make the smaller upgrades smaller and more numerous. Players will forgive that more than if you make all upgrades small. If you have more than two kinds of ammo, like missiles, beam ammo, and power bombs and echoes, make sure only one has a lot of capacity upgrades. There should be less than 10 of each other ammo upgrade. That means 9 or less beam ammo upgrades and 9 or less power bomb upgrades. The reasoning is the same. Only one ammo type will be forgiven for having a ton of upgrades. A minor detail I'll only mention because of Beyond is that you should only have one secondary weapon, not 2, 3, or 4 like Beyond did with its shots. Instead, have multiple primary weapons. This may feel like a silly difference, but it changes how you'll design and balance additional weapons. If they're secondary, you'll want them to be consistent in power with one another. They'll be made to handle specific situations. If they're primary, you'll want them to feel stronger and weaker than one another. It will encourage your team to make the right kind of design decisions without even asking them to. And lastly, the game needs to have a set of items you need to collect to unlock the final area and face the final boss. There needs to be no requirement to picking these up. They can't be like the mech parts in Beyond. They need to be hidden in the environment, not given as a reward for beating a boss. They can't be progression markers like the keys in Beyond. There needs to be a countable number between 9 and 21 hidden in the world. They can't be countless like the green crystals in Beyond. How they should be hidden? Entirely up to you. They can be behind walls, in hard-to-reach out-of-the-way places, and one could be an enemy if you so choose. If you want to offer players some help, just add some hints to the room where they need to take all the items, like Prime did. You could also place something to signify one's near, like Echoes did with the fallen Luminoth soldiers. If you're worried players won't know to collect them, don't. One of the key aspects of a Metroidvania is collecting items. Make them look fancy, but make sure they don't do anything. That will signal to the player that they are special, unique in some way. That will be enough. Honestly, signaling to the player where to take them is more important. There are a few ways you can do this, but I'll leave that up to you. If you want to develop a good Metroidvania FPS, you should be able to solve this problem without relying on a cutscene telling the player where to go. If you and your team can't do that, you might want to make a few smaller games first. Build up your skills and come back to this later. It's an important skill you'll need for this genre. If you follow this advice and don't make these mistakes, whatever you're working on, whether it's the next Metroid Prime or your own new Metroidvania FPS, you'll make something good. I tried my best to elaborate on why you want to listen, but it's okay if you want to forge your own path and prove me wrong. I believe the right design can make any idea work for a game. The problem is, no one's done it yet. And the question is, do you actually know how to pull it off, or do you just believe you do? You can never know until you try. It pains me to say, but Metroid Prime is a series that gets better the further you go into its past. And I believe a lot of that is because the developers aren't familiar with the elements that make a Metroid Prime, Metroid Prime. And it's probably a self-inflicted injury by Nintendo. At its core, Metroid Prime has always been a game about exploration. It isn't a first-person adventure game like Nintendo says. It isn't a game where you're shooting your way through rooms and happen to be on an unexplored planet gathering power-ups. No, Metroid Prime is a Metroidvania FPS, a game where you explore a planet and gather items, but also happen to be in a first-person perspective with an arm cannon. That sounds like a small semantic difference, but when it comes to planning and developing a game, when it comes to communicating what a game needs to be, it changes everything. Not only in gameplay, but in level design. And that's all before I fall into the rant about how the Metroidvania genre should probably be split up by now. Kind of like how there's CRPGs, JRPGs, and RPGs. They share the basic building blocks, mainly when it comes to level design and the basic concept, but when you go into actual gameplay, things are very different. But that's a discussion for another time. It really deserves a deep dive that I'll try to make one day. It's this mistake. Making a game for the wrong genre that Corruption and Beyond suffer from. It's why they feel worse compared to the original two games for the GameCube. It's not a fatal mistake, but it is a critical one. The levels will always feel wrong and they'll lack the replayability of older games, all because there's only one path you can take, only one way to play. And I truly think the only reason there was a loud backlash with Beyond, but not Corruption, is because social media was still in its infancy when Corruption came out. Only review publications had the reach to set a narrative. But it's time for me to move on from Metroid Prime. I'll be honest, I didn't enjoy making this video. The reviews, I like making those. But this, I'm still not sure what a retrospective of Metroid Prime should have been. That's a sign I shouldn't record the voiceover, edit a video, and publish it. Yet, here we are. I said I'd do it, so I'm doing it. I'm sorry this video took so long. I was planning to make a video on Metaphor ReFantasio next, but then Star Fox was announced and released, which I want to do a video on. And then there was the Halo campaign Evolved, which I'll admit I'm curious about. One of those three will be my next video, unless something else catches my eye. I'll use my next 3 videos to decide if I want to keep this up, or if I want to move on from YouTube. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll be trying something a little different with my next review, so it's more focused on what's actually important for a game and my thoughts, and less the mechanics. It occurred to me that I've been a bit too analytical for game reviews. It's been more like a post-mortem. Hopefully it won't take another 3 months, but enough rambling. Have a good rest of your day.